Hello there, Internet. Thanks for stopping by. Today we're going to be talking about setting up and hosting your own Jitsi Meet server. Jitsi is for lack of a better word, Zoom alternative. It does audio video conferencing, but the cool part is it's open source and you can host it on your own hardware or even hardware that you rent through DigitalOcean, Linode, one of those other cloud providers. So today we're going to be talking through why you would want to set it up, the things you're going to need to do before you set it up, and then walk through a quick install and just kind of show it off. So this first part's going to be philosophy. I'll put a timestamp down below if you just want to skip to how to actually get this thing set up on your own hardware. But with that being said, let's go into the why would you want to do this in the first place if Zoom or Skype or Teams or GoToMeeting is already working just fine for you. So with the onset of COVID-19, a lot more of us have begun to work remotely. That means more video calls, more audio conference calls, and a lot of new software that maybe we're not used to leaning on as heavily as we are today. Some of the big players in the game, Zoom, Microsoft Skype, Microsoft Teams, GoToMeeting comes to mind. There's any number of service providers for this. And one thing all those people have in common is we really have no idea what their software is doing. It's not open source. So before we get into that discussion, let's just sketch out real quick what's happening when we use these services, just from a user point of view. So I found this technical diagram. Definitely did not draw this myself. But down here are our users. So they are connecting to a server that is running whatever program is running the video call. We'll just say Zoom. We'll pick on them. Zoom is running on this server. Zoom takes what they're putting in, sends it back out to all the other parties on the call, and that's how conversation happens. So between the user and the server, we can feel fairly confident that that line of communication is secure, and we can thank math for that. So the connection between here and here, pretty good, so let's not worry about that. Instead, let's worry about everything else happening in this situation. So once your ones and zeros get to the server, who knows what's happening? We have no transparency into the software running on this server, and we also have no idea even where this server is and who controls it. I can't even guarantee it's on planet Earth, and we have no idea who has access to this hardware. And anyone that can access hardware, they're probably going to own your stuff, or they could potentially own your stuff. So what can we do to take back some of that control? How can we make that situation even a little bit better? So for starters, we can lean more heavily on transparent software. It can be software so what can we do to make the situation even a little bit better, tilt the scales even a little bit in our favor? Well, the first thing we can do is rely on more transparent open source software. In theory, you can examine all the code that is running your stuff and feel better about, what's going on that server. Cool, step one, let's just only use open source software whenever possible. But that doesn't really solve this hardware problem. So congratulations, you're running open source software on a box in a server center somewhere on the East Coast. Again, not having any idea who has access to that hardware and what they could be doing, to manipulate the software running on it. So what if we could run open source software on hardware that we controlled? That'd be pretty cool. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And why? Because we can. It's not that difficult. And I think a lot of us probably have the resources laying around. I've got a Linux box over here just idling away. I've got a gigabit fiber connection. I may as well use it. And for the meetings I'm going to be hosting, 3, 4, 5 people, it's not going to require a lot of resources. Now, could 300 people jump onto my Linux box and talk? Absolutely not. I just don't have those. I don't have that bandwidth, and I don't have those computing resources. But it's going to be a really cool experience. You're going to learn a lot about how video conferencing software works. You might learn a bit more about your machine, and now you're one of the cool kids. You're the one hosting your own video conferencing software. So there is some stuff we're going to have to set up before we get started with the install, and we're going to go into that next. So I found before embarking on a project like this, there's a lot of value in just sketching it out. It's going to help you break it down into some smaller, more manageable pieces, and it's going to help us visualize exactly what we're trying to do. So really all we're doing is just our own version of this diagram right here. We're going to have users out here in the wild. They're going to need a domain name that's going to point them home. That connection is going to hit your firewall. Your firewall is going to have to make some decisions about what packets go where, and it's going to have to send those packets to, in our case, a virtual machine running Jitsi. So all seems pretty doable. This kind of pseudo tutorial does assume a certain degree of technical experience. For instance, I'm going to assume that you're comfortable setting up a virtual machine. I'm going to assume that you're comfortable interacting with your home firewall, whether that's pfSense or just the settings on your Netgear router. You're going to have to know how to forward ports to this VM. You're going to need to know how to assign this VM static IP on your network. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to assume that you're already comfortable doing that. You're going to have to secure a domain name. This doesn't have to be one that you pay for. You can go through a service like, say, NoIP and get one of their domains to point back to your home IP address. So I'm not going to walk through all that, but those are the things that you're going to want to be comfortable with and kind of have taken care of before we get started. So go ahead and do all that. I'll wait. Okay, good job getting all that done. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that you have set up a virtual machine running Ubuntu Server 18.04. I'm going to assume that you've already assigned it a static IP address on your network. Pro tip, if you change your network settings to bridged, it's going to have its own IP address on your LAN. It's going to be as if it were its own box on the network. The default mode for, say, VirtualBox is just to sort of piggyback or tunnel along with the host machine's connection. We want this thing on the network receiving packets itself. So you've got Ubuntu Server 18.04 all set up in a VM. You've got it assigned a static IP. You've gone out and secured a domain name that points home. Now we can get into the actual install instructions and see what that looks like. So I'm going to be referencing two different tutorials. There's one here on DigitalOcean that talks about installing Jitsi Meet on one of their droplets. It's a really good piece of documentation. I followed it and found a lot of value in it. We're also going to be referencing the actual Jitsi Meet documentation. Let me make that bigger. There we go. And we are going to be referencing this towards the end for some really specific self-hosting stuff, because the DigitalOcean instructions are going to walk us through how to set it up on someone else hosting it for you. But let's just go through these instructions and see what they look like. So step 1, setting up your host name. So the first thing we're going to do is change the host name of our virtual machine. So over here in the terminal, I'm SSH'd in to my virtual machine simply because it's running on a separate box over yonder. If you're doing all this on one machine, it's going to be right there in front of you, but same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that you've already done an update like a good little system administrator. If you haven't, sudo apt update, sudo apt upgrade, just to make sure that you're set up for success there. So now we are going to be changing the actual host name of this system. So this right here is going to be the domain that you've already set up pointing home. It could be something like friends.humandecoded.com or whatever domain you've set up to point back home. It goes right there, and press enter and you're good to go. And next step, we're going to have to edit our hosts file. So we're going to fire up our good friend Nano and open up the hosts file. And it wants us to add this line right here. Again, this is going to be your domain that you have pointing home. All right, now that that's done, let's keep scrolling down and see what's next. Okay, so here are instructions to configure your firewall. You're not going to follow these instructions explicitly because we need to modify our actual home firewall. In this case, a DigitalOcean droplet is just out there on the internet, so you're actually modifying the firewall that's sitting on that droplet. We're still going to be opening up all these ports, but you're going to have to do this on your firewall. So again, I assume that you know how to port forward, how to open up ports on your firewall. But we're going to need to forward port 80, 443, 4443, and 10,000 over to our virtual machine. And that's why we assigned it a static IP address earlier. So go ahead, whatever firewall software you're using, make sure that these 4 ports are getting forwarded to your virtual machine's IP on the LAN. Like in my case, something like 192.168.1.209. Okay, moving on. I promise we're actually about to install software. Most of our prep work has already been done now. So next thing we need to do is we need to go out and grab the Jitsi public key. This is going to allow our system to verify that the software it's downloading is legit from Jitsi and not someone masquerading as Jitsi. Next, we're going to add that to our apt keyring. And then finally, we can go ahead and get rid of the key that we just downloaded because it's already been copied over. Next thing we're going to do is we need to add Jitsi stable list to our sources list. This is going to allow apt to know, hey, I need to be going out there and looking for this. And Control-O to save, Control-X to exit. Okay, so now whenever we do a sudo apt update, it's going to be looking in the Jitsi repository for updates. So now we can finally, at long last, install Jitsi Meet. Look at it go. So the installation is going to pause here in just a second, and it's going to ask us to put in our domain name. Again, this is the domain that you set up to point back home. I can tell you from horrible experience, do not mess this part up. It will mess up your entire installation. So again, this is the domain that you put in pointing back home. Okay, now that that's done, it's going to ask you if you want to generate a self-signed certificate. Absolutely. What's going to happen here is that this is what's going to allow that encryption between client and your server. Think of a certificate as what allows you to use HTTPS. It's essentially a thing that says, hey, I'm into encryption. You want to encrypt some stuff? And your client says, oh yeah, I would love to encrypt some traffic to you. But then the next step is really interesting. We're taking it a step further. So congratulations, you have a self-signed cert, but from an actual security point of view, that's worthless because the user has no way to verify who they're encrypting with. It's just some entity on the internet that says, hey, let's do some encryption. Take my word for it that I'm the actual, domain that you're trying to get to. So we need someone else to vouch for us. We need a third party to go in and sign our certificate and say, yeah, based off what we can see, this person is the one that controls this domain, and they're probably who you wanted to connect with. So this next process, we are going to have Let's Encrypt sign our certificate. So first we're going to add the certbot repository. And then we're going to install certbot. And during the install, it is going to ask you for a valid email address, but it's not going to send you a link to verify or anything like that. It's just wants an email address on file. Okay, and let's install certbot. Yes, I would love to. And then finally, it's going to ask us to run this shell script right here. Okay, enter your email address and press. Okay, and if you're curious, this is the entire reason why we had port 80 open on our firewall to begin with. Let's Encrypt needs that open to do whatever it does to verify that, hey, you're the person that probably controls this domain. I'm cool signing off on it. So once this process is done, go ahead and close port 80. You never want to have ports open that you don't absolutely have to have open. So once this is all done, go ahead and get rid of port 80. Don't need it. After that, there are some instructions here that I do recommend following, but we're not going to walk through it for this tutorial. This is going to set you up so not just anybody can start a meeting on your server. As it is right now, anyone that connects to your Jitsi server, with that domain could fire up and host whatever meeting they wanted to. So we don't want that. This is going to walk you through setting up users that have meeting privileges. So only people you designate can log in and start a meeting, but anyone can still join a meeting. Oh, no. Okay. So red text is never a good thing whenever you're doing this. And I just realized I did not open up port 80. So I'm going to go fix my firewall, and we're going to do this again. There we go. Sorry about that. So congratulations. My certificate and chain have been saved. Hooray. So if you ever run into problems like that, just make sure that your firewall is open and going where it's supposed to go. Make sure that your domain name is pointing to the right IP address, and you should be able to work through it. So now that that's all done, we're just about done. There's just one or two more steps we are going to have to take care of because we're self-hosting, or we're hosting on our own hardware, I should say. These instructions only apply to DigitalOcean. So let's click over to the self-hosting guide that Jitsi put together. And if you scroll through here, this is going to look a lot like the instructions that we just went through. I used the DigitalOcean ones because I thought they were easier to follow and easier to read. So this tells you what ports to forward. That looks familiar. Goes through the same process of getting your cert signed by Let's Encrypt. Install Jitsi Meet. The spot we're looking for is down here under Advanced Configuration. So there's one more step we have to do, and we have to modify this file right here. So again, we're going to use nano. and it wants us to add these 2 lines. So we're going to change this over. We're going to have to plug in our local IP address, so the IP on the LAN, as well as our public IP address where our domain name is pointing to right here. And then it wants us to comment out this line. So we'll do that first. Comment that out. I'm going to plug in my LAN IP, my public IP, save it, and we should be just about there. Moment of truth. Before we try this out for the first time, I've always found it's good just to restart your VM. Oops. Just in case. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it can save you a ton of headaches later. While you're at it, I'd go ahead and reset the state table on your firewall just to make sure everything is flowing the way that it's supposed to. When you're ever in a project like this, playing with the firewall, setting up a server on a VM, you can never have too many resets, and it's really going to make troubleshooting easier. Had to find that out the hard way. So right now, I'm going to pull up Chrome just because I've been showing you kind of a hardened, or I've been working in kind of a hardened version of Firefox. I found Chrome, like just a vanilla version of Chrome, to play a lot nicer with any sort of video conferencing software. So I'm going to put in my domain name, and it should pull up a Jitsi server. Okay, everyone, I am really sorry about that. It looks like maybe the domain I'd set up hadn't had time to filter through. That's why every time I tried to put the domain name into Google Chrome, it was just coming up with, hey, I can't find this place. So wait a few minutes, tried it again, and now boom, here we are. This is exciting. So let's just go ahead and set up a meeting. Alrighty, and there I am. That is a webcam. Now let's see if we can join the meeting. I'll just jump on my phone, jump off my home Wi-Fi. And see if we can't connect. One thing I will say on pfSense Firewall, make sure that your NAT reflection settings are set to NAT plus proxy. It took me a long time to figure that out, but since I'm connecting from the LAN and from the internet, that was the setting that I found to work for me. Okay, let's see if we can't join this meeting from our phone. Hey, there I am. And that's a lot of echo. Cool. We did it. Alrighty. So that was it. Not the simplest thing in the world, but it's cool now. Now I've got a Jitsi server out there that anybody can connect to, and we can host a much more private meeting than you would find on a platform like Zoom. So hope you found this interesting. I'll also do a text write-up, humandecoded.io, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.